I'm Dean Spade. I'm a professor at Seattle University School of Law, and I'm also a member of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. I grew up in Central Virginia with a single mom, and then later with some foster parents. And I grew up as a poor person. I think that had a lot of impact on my understanding of the world, and also with a single parent and seeing like the sexism my mom experienced as a low-wage worker trying to get by, and in the welfare system. So I think I was heavily politicized by the mid-90s welfare reform, which really helped me understand the stakes of some important politics that I really cared about. And I was also heavily politicized by feminist and queer movements in that same time period. So I think that led me to sort of formulating a politics that said, how can we have racial and economic justice be the center of queer and trans resistance instead of an afterthought or something that's entirely left behind?
So do you have some success stories you want to share? I know you're involved heavily in fights to stop a new youth prison in Seattle, similarly involved in the stop and frisk campaigns in New York.
Yeah, I think that some of the most exciting strategies I see around the country are strategies to stop the expansion of criminalization and immigration enforcement. So that looks like a lot of different things on the ground. It looks like people in local places like we're doing in Seattle trying to stop them from building new prisons and jails. That's huge. The system keeps expanding, it keeps sucking more people into it and hurting them while they're there, right, and not solving any of our problems. So stopping those things from expanding. Also, there's a major national movement to stop what Obama's called secure communities, right? This sort of framework of increasing the participation between immigration enforcement and criminalization. It's also seen, obviously, in SB 1070, the famous controversial "Show Me Your Papers" law in Arizona. That whole trend towards criminalizing immigration and forcing more and more immigrants to live under worse and worse conditions is being fought back in so many levels, right? So to me, and also the campaigns against the stop and frisk here in New York City that have been very publicized, all of these are efforts to look at what is making this system keep devouring our communities. How do we dismantle brick by brick these sort of really harmful machines that are leading our communities into these prisons, and how do we actually build what we need to really be safe, which these prisons aren't going to do?
There's two things I want to just quickly lift up from your book, which is some of the ways you use language. One of them is you don't talk about discrimination, you talk about life shortening. I'd like to ask you about that choice. And then the other, you talk about an imprisoning society, and you talk about people being criminalized, whereas in most legal texts you read about people conducting or engaging in criminal behavior or criminality existing in certain communities. Talk about some of those choices and what you're thinking, what's the thinking behind them.
Yeah.
Life shortening.
Life shortening. So the reason that I talk about harm and violence facing communities in terms of life shortening, or sometimes I talk about the distribution of life chances, is because I'm trying to get us to think in a material way on the ground about why some people's lives are affected by lack of health care, lack of adequate nutrition, being exposed to more pollutants because they live in a neighborhood that's been targeted for that kind of industry. Those kinds of sort of really material, harmful conditions that face us and that I think our communities are trying to resist and resolve. I'm trying to talk about that because I want us to move away from a conversation that's solely about whether we can get the law to say good things about us, whether we can say, the government has declared that it's not okay to beat up trans people, right? That we have the federal Matthew Shepard, James Byrd hate crimes law, and people see it as a big stance against violence. Of course, it won't prevent the violence that we're talking about, and all the actual material conditions shortening our lives are happening all the time, right, and are being exploited and increased by austerity measures and other moves from that same government that now declares that our deaths are a problem, right? So I think that part of what the book is trying to do is shift us away from asking what does the law say about us to what are legal structures doing to us and how do we actually resolve material conditions.
Hence the active verbs around criminalizing and imprisoning.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing about criminalization is that our current prison system and our sort of we live in a country where 24 hours a day you can watch Law & Order on TV, right? There's a lot of propaganda around criminality that tells us that there's these dangerous, bad people, serial killers, serial rapists, they've got these criminal behaviors. In reality, our criminal justice system works very differently than that, right? The reality is that all of us break laws all the time, but only certain people in certain communities are heavily policed and pushed into prisons, usually for very low-level crimes related to poverty. So when we move away from thinking about individual criminals and bad people, which is kind of the fiction that justifies the system, and instead looking at these giant nets that are cast over primarily people of color and poor people communities to bring in more and more people into these private prison systems where, prison guards unions and prison corporations, are seeking to influence politicians to pass more criminalizing laws that will fill the beds and make more money. So it's a very different way of thinking about what criminality is and what crime is and what we would actually do to try to have a safer country.
Does it change our perspective on change making and how social justice increases in society? We often are led to believe, well, if you let some people go forward, then the rest of us will follow. But you suggest it's the other way around.
Yeah, so one of the ideas that I notice is really centered in a lot of the activism that I care about and am writing about is an idea that I call trickle-up social justice as opposed to trickle-down. So one of the ways of thinking about social change is let's get the few most charismatic people, the people who look the most like what society already thinks are good people, and have a few really spectacular cases and maybe some New York Times articles about them, and people will think we're good and like us, and perhaps we will make an advance for everyone. Turns out that doesn't really work, right? It turns out that if you solve the problem for people who are the least vulnerable of the vulnerable, usually you end up mobilizing ideas that actually further the stigma of those who are considered outside or not good enough, right? And so the idea of trickle-up social justice is that we should actually ethically start with those who are facing the worst conditions, who are most losing their lives, right? Those people in prisons and immigration facilities and experiencing poverty and homelessness. We should start by figuring out how to solve the problems for them. And inevitably that will solve the problems for everyone, right? But it's not the reverse. And so that's part of, I think, the idea that's really a critique of the gay and lesbian rights framework that has really taken up the kind of, strategy of choosing a few charismatic white couples and having that be the image of what an anti-homophobic framework is. And that hasn't really worked out for people on the bottom.